Good afternoon, everybody. I am going to go ahead and start. It is 4 o'clock. My name is Susan Inman, and I am the Senior Field Specialist here at the Qualia Institute for Student Aspirations. Thank you for joining us for our webinar this afternoon entitled Cultural Competency and the Relationship Gap, Working to Close the Achievement Gap. We are very honored to have Dr. Rhonda Knight with us here this afternoon. Before I introduce her and let her get started on the presentation, the webinar, just a couple of technical notes. You've noticed that we are using the chat box to communicate back and forth. So please, throughout the session, feel free to type in a question or any troubleshooting needs in the chat box, and we will be working with you through that venue. And again, a lot of you have already typed in your name. If you're with a group of folks, your role and where you're from. Looks like we have quite a few people. We have folks from Portland, Maine. We have folks from Ohio, Xenia. Is it Xenia?
Xenia.
Xenia, thanks, Rhonda. Northmont. We have folks from Colorado, I think I saw. We have some folks from Montana. So it looks like we're kind of going around the country here, which is really, really great. So let me introduce to you Dr. Rhonda Knight. As some of you may know, she's an assistant professor at Muskingum University in New Concord, Ohio. And she teaches middle, childhood, and graduate level teacher preparation courses. Dr. Knight integrates dialogue, literature, and diverse experiences to ensure her students understand cultural competence, cultural relevance, and cultural relevant teaching strategies. So without further ado, I turn this over to Dr. Knight. Thanks, Rhonda, for joining us.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you. I'm looking forward to the opportunity to talk and engage with everyone that is signed in as much as possible. So if any time during the webinar, if you have questions, please feel free to ask those questions, and we'll be following you. And in teacher style and format, I will engage you. It is my hope to be able to engage you and to ask you to maybe respond to a couple of prompts. And you can do so by typing into the chat box. As Susan said, I am an assistant professor. A lot of my time I spend in the classroom, I spend talking about culture and the importance culture plays in teaching and learning. As I've done this work, it has really come to what I believe in understanding cultural competency is a significant piece and tool in looking at how we work to close the achievement gap. And as you see titled here, that would be through closing the relationship gap. I also want to go on to say that I am a former classroom teacher myself. And so having taught in the classroom, I know firsthand what it means to make those cultural connections. I remember walking into the classroom and realizing I didn't have a cultural understanding or a cultural connection with my students. And it was from that place moving forward that I really began to understand cultural competency, and throughout my work began to make connections with the relationship gap. First, I'm going to go to just sharing with you the three main topics that we're going to talk about today. First, we have to look at how we define culture. I think that is a big part of understanding cultural competency, is recognizing how we define culture. I find that a lot of times how people define culture stops in one place, and I want to make sure that we have a bigger understanding of how we define culture. The second topic we will discuss is the role culture plays in teaching and learning, and that being a significant role. And then finally, the relationship gap. Understanding a gap does exist as we work to close the achievement gap. And what we're going to do is we're going to work to close the relationship gap, because I believe when we work to close the relationship gap, we can begin closing the achievement gap. So let me start with that as a matter of fact, because as we look at closing the relationship gap, as we look at closing the achievement gap, a lot of the work that we've done in addressing closing the achievement gap has been through curriculum, has been through instruction, assessment, and data. Now let me zero in and focus a little bit more. If you think about it, there have been drives to address closing the achievement gap through curriculum, whether it's addressing providing content standards. Now with the Common Core, we've done curriculum, pacing guides, you know, setting out all these different ways to address curriculum. The next thing, you know, there's the drive for instruction. I don't know how many people have attended grade level instructional strategies. And actually, let me put that out there for a second. If you could type in the chat box whether you understand and agree or even participated or been a part of, you know, addressing the achievement gap, closing the achievement gap through instruction, through saying that we need to increase the level of grade level instructional strategies that we have, whether it's been, wait, we need to address content instructional strategies, or it's both. How do we work to close the achievement gap by, you know, changing, thinking about our best practices when it comes to grade level instructional strategies, content instructional strategies, or reteaching. That has been a piece as well. We need to go back in and reteach this material, but really has it just been that factor? So another way that we have looked at saying we need to address closing the achievement gap is through assessment. I think we could all agree that assessment has been one way. You know, we started with standardized testing, we have achievement tests, and we know formative, summative tests, assessments, and benchmarks. And then now we have data. How do we collect data? What data are we collecting? And the question is supposed to be, how do we use that data to inform instruction? And then even looking at value added when we talk about, you know, how we are working to close the achievement gap when it comes to individual students. Does this make sense to everyone? Okay. I love the exclamation point, yes. I'm waiting for the all capital letters, yes. So when we look at that, when we truly look at saying, okay, we've done this and we've done that, there we are, Cassandra, capital letters, yes, most definitely. But have we really seen the achievement gap significantly close? Would someone like to answer that question? Or, because we're trying curriculum, we're looking at instruction, we're looking at assessment, we're looking at data. And I think across the board, when you talk to, you know, whether it's your colleagues or someone in another district or in another state, it's still there. The achievement gap still exists. So what do we do? It's kind of like, I give this analogy. If you, excuse me, I'll put it this way. If you want to lose weight and you're working to lose weight and you're trying this diet and this diet's not working, well, do we keep using the same diet? Or do we begin to really rethink the approach and maybe some of the things that are part of that are working, but how do we now reach out to something else and really look at a bigger picture? And so that's really what I'm talking about here. I'm not saying curriculum is not important and how we address curriculum. I'm not saying instruction is not important. By golly, assessment's not going anywhere. I think we can all agree with that. Data, If the assessment's there, then the data's there. So if we have all of that, then what next? Well, I say look at the relationship gap using cultural competency and culturally relevant teaching strategies to close the achievement gap. So where do we go then? How do we define culture? How do we define culture? So as we look at how we define culture, there's something that we can do. We can go to the dictionary, all of us being, able to, at the click of a button, look at the online dictionary definition. And so we could do that. But this is what I'd like to do before we do that. Before I go to the definition, I'd like us to think about culture in the way of an iceberg. Okay. And then I'll refer back to some of the notes here. For a second, what I'd like you to do is, if you have a pen and paper, pencil and paper, take that out and draw an iceberg. Doesn't have to be perfect. I know I'm not an artist. I'm told by my little people that is that really a person? It's, well, and I'll say it's the best stick figure that I could make. But if you could, take a piece of paper, and on that paper make an iceberg. And then if you could, draw the water across the iceberg. That's my water, and I'm sticking to it. When we talk about culture and when we look at culture, there are things that we can see. There are things that when we talk about who we are culturally, it's the visible part of who we are. And that exists and it's visible. So what I'd like you to do is in our chat box, and you could start on your paper first, write down the things that when you understand culture, what are some of the things that you see when it comes to whether it's yourself or other people. Okay. I see, okay, clothing, appearance, dance, holiday traditions. Tony Thomas and I'm just going to say the group from Beth Cooper, insights into behavior, traditions from Cheryl. Those are all the things that we definitely are a part of culture, and those are the things that we see that fall below the waterline. Those are the things that we call less visible. So values, behaviors. How about this one? Dreams, traditions. I see traditions. What about aspirations? Here's another one, habits. I'll go back up and I saw art. Language, I think, is one that I've had people share as far as things that they can see. Music. And that's, you talk about similarities and differences. That's something that we're going to get to because there are similarities and differences that definitely do exist. I'll put also over here, roles as related to gender, age, class, So does this all make sense as we look at culture and how we define culture? Basically, what I wanted to do is create the understanding that culture is everything that we can see and everything that we don't see. And that's important when we begin to look at what it means to address our students from a cultural standpoint, and even understanding cultural competency. So this is what we'll do. Culture. Merriam Dictionary online. I'll give you a second to read. And I think that pretty much that makes sense, that we define culture in that manner, in that way. As we begin to look at how we define culture, you know, there's another aspect of thinking about culture that I really like for people to hold on to and to grasp and to think about this, especially in its role in teaching and learning. And I'm going to pull this up and show you that piece that is less visible. And this is this quote right here. And that quote was from Elvis Presley. But I think that's important as we think about who our students are, as we think about, you know, who we are, and going into the classroom. We all have this cultural self, who we are. We all have stereotypes. We all have beliefs. We all have conceptions and misconceptions, perceptions of, you know, our students, the community that we serve. And so what I'd like to do for a moment is, as we begin to really understand and think about what culture is, in knowing what culture is, when we talk about cultural competency, one of the first steps that I like to take is really saying and asking the question, who am I? And so what I'd like you to do is take a moment and list 5 characteristics about yourself. How do you label, define, act, interact? And if you need to, refer back to the definition of culture. And as any teacher, I'll give you about 30 seconds to do that. So what are some of the things that you came up with when you think about who you are? When you pull out 5 characteristics, and it's funny because whenever I ask people to do this, it's not always as easy for some people. But think about 5 characteristics about yourself. For myself, I'd say African American. I would also define myself as traditional. A parent, female, the reason why it's important to ask the question, who am I? And to really take the time to list out characteristics about yourself is because, as put by one researcher, we teach who we are. And when we know who we are, it definitely does have an impact and can have a greater impact on how we teach. Janet, thank you for listing family beliefs. So your beliefs is sounds like that's a lot of who you are. So I'll give you an example of who I am from that perspective of family beliefs. For me, I was rooted in everybody goes to college. You go to college and everybody goes to college. And it wasn't until a little bit later that my mother reminded me that not everyone goes to college. Not from the perspective of you don't prepare everyone to go to college as a classroom teacher, but being mindful of the fact that not everyone makes that choice and decision, and that's still okay. And so from the teaching standpoint for myself, I remember having a student and referring her to a school that was college prep. When we had another school that was career-based. And then after we talked, I realized that she would be better suited for the career-based school, knowing exactly the career path that she wanted to take. But also being mindful as a teacher that I prepared her to go to college, meaning understanding that she could make a choice after it's all said and done. If she decides to go to college, she could, but also knowing that her decision and choice was to go to a career path right after school. The bottom line was she was prepared to do that. Nathan, I see that you've typed in spiritually minded. Tony, extrovert, dad, husband, baby boomer, and spiritual. Think about that, and how does that affect who you are if you're in the classroom or if you have been in the classroom? Does that play a role in how you teach? And I'll be honest, for myself, it definitely did. When I first went into the classroom, knowing that I had this traditional mindset and also recognizing and understanding that we teach who we are, but we also teach how we've been taught. Recognizing that I was this traditional person, I had to go back and really rethink my approach to the classroom. I had to go back and really rethink how I taught. And so, but it wasn't until I was able to recognize and tap into that for myself. Let's see. All right. So that is the next question. Based on the list, how does this impact how we interact with our students? Janet, yes, we bring our beliefs to the classroom. It does have an impact on our students. Would someone else like to give an example of how it impacts, or how it interacts, or how it impacts how we interact with our students? It also can impact how we structure our classrooms. I'll give you an example. I was this traditional person, and I mentioned this, and it was raise your hand, don't get out of your seat. I'm the one giving you the information. I'm the teacher, and so it is, you move when I say move. We do based on my, my instruction. And my classroom was at one time, I will say that much, at one time, structured in that traditional way. And it wasn't until I, began to have a greater understanding of, who my students were, that while I was a traditional person, recognizing that that was who I was, did not necessarily have to play out in the classroom. Rachel, we pay more attention to those students, yes, who are seemingly more like ourselves. And that makes a lot of sense. We connect with people because, yes, it's like us. core beliefs, allowing our core beliefs to guide us through situations. Yes, Cassandra, our stereotypical labels regarding kids and their families. That's a huge one, because you know what? We're human and we all have stereotypes. It's what you do once you've acknowledged those stereotypes. Excuse me. So Cassandra, thank you for putting that there, because that is a big part of it. When we recognize, how we are choosing to label, per se, our students, what does that mean for us? Yes, Tony, past experiences impact our beliefs. That is so true. And for some of us, recognizing that students, maybe past students, aren't necessarily going to be like, our current students, recognizing that we need to begin to understand the culture of each of our students, because even when we recognize that piece, while there are similarities within cultures, there is also that cultural self, those qualities and characteristics that still make you different. And so when you think about the characteristics of who you are, when you go back to the definition of culture, the next thing is to really say, based on this, how does it impact how I interact with my students? How does it impact based on who I am, and having a better understanding of who I am culturally, how we structure our classrooms? Okay. And then, there's always how we set expectations. Because when you even recognize how you set expectations, it is saying that sometimes for some students, we will set expectations that are lower. Lower for some students than they would be for other students. I had a colleague one time say, well, he's just a good kid. And since he's such a good kid, I think he's doing better than what he actually was doing on paper, is pretty much where this teacher's mindset was. And, I thought, wow, I had started my classroom that year out recognizing that this student had dreams and aspirations. And this was over 10 years ago, when this student had tapped into the fact that he wanted to be a chef. And everything out there now, it's popular to be a chef. And this was a dream and a desire of his before it was popular. And so what I'd recognized was, because this kid was a good kid, the other teacher, one of my colleagues, wanted to lower expectations, and forgot that even though he was poor and even though he was struggling academic, because he's a nice kid, I'm going to lower expectations. It's at that point we say, I need to make sure that all expectations are high for all of my students. Yes. Janet, you're absolutely right. We have our own beliefs, and then while you have those beliefs, be mindful of the differences in our students' beliefs, because there's a likelihood that your students are going to have different beliefs as yours. What the research shows now is that the majority of our but the majority of our teacher population are Caucasian females. And we know that our schools across the nation, are growing much more diverse. When we look at the year 2060, and if you're like me, when I heard this statistic, the first thing that I did was, okay, where will I be and how old will I be in 2060? And I looked at the fact, okay, so 2060, I'll still be here, maybe, but 2060, the nation, when we talk about minorities, minorities will be the majority. And so when we look at even how that will shift over time. We could even look at the year 2043, but just over time it's shifting, and recognizing as we make that shift, how do we begin to make connections with those children in our classrooms? You know, there are districts that didn't look like they used to look 5 years ago, 3 years ago, 10 years ago. But the teacher population pretty much is the same. And so how do we begin to recognize and ask questions of who I am, but then also in doing that, tapping into having an understanding of who our students are. And Janet, you said it, mindful of the differences our students have with their beliefs and everything that they bring to the table and the impact that has. So as you've answered that question for yourself, who am I? And based on who I am, how does it impact how we interact with our students, how we structure our classroom, and how we set our expectations? The next thing that I like to do is ask, who are my students? And when you begin to ask that question, who are my students? I'd like everyone, if you could for a moment, so I'll give you about 30 seconds, and make a list. Make a list of who are my students. Just go down the list and think of, you know, culturally who they are, statistically who they are, however you begin to think of your students, jot down those words. And then take a moment to type some of those in. Again, remember to think about it just think about the first words that come in your mind, come to mind when you think about who your students are. Okay. As you're thinking of the list, there's one way that some people think about how we think about who our students are. Kids from hard places. I have curious, social, hormonal, yes, Beth, are you in a middle school? Hormonal. Instant gratification, dependent, capable, cooperative, techie and tech savvy. Well, but yes, I kind of figured that that hormonal hits it right there on the head. Deficit model of thinking. So let me go back to that piece right there. When we talk about who our students are, sometimes we can also go to the fact that they come from hard places. What I've heard sometimes, they have parents that don't care, that you know that they're hard to teach, that they can't read, that they're low skills. I did a workshop just in January, on one of the days in which we were in school in January. I asked the teachers to make a list of who their students are, and one of the kindergarten teachers wrote down the word aggressive. And when I looked at that, and when the group looked at that, we thought, okay, so what does that really mean? And someone changed that to, I'm going to get what I want. I'm hardworking. I am protective of what's mine. And as we began to really uncover what some of those words meant, we talked about how that has the potential to come from that deficit model of thinking, in the sense that sometimes we can think about who our students are from that negative perspective, from what they don't bring to the table, when in all actuality, students bring qualities and characteristics to the table that that don't have to be from that deficit model of thinking. And so we begin to think about it from this different perspective, and that's cultural capital. We begin to think of the qualities or characteristics your students bring to the classroom, like the capable, the cooperative, the students who are hardworking, and then students that have aspirational capital. All students come to the classroom with aspirational capital. If we step back and think of it from that perspective for a moment and say the students who come to our classroom all desire, all have aspirations. Some children have to, and if you could see my hand, go over, maybe under, come around to get to it, whatever those aspirations are. The fact of the matter is that they come to the classroom with aspirations, and when we can recognize who, what those aspirations are, oh, it makes a difference, and that's huge. Sorry, Cassandra, I'm reading. It says that your students are adult learners, variety of backgrounds and experiences. That work, and then you have, it sounds like, white middle-aged women. Are those the teachers working with your diversity populations? And so then if that is the case, then we ask, how do we tap into understanding who we are to better understand what it means to understand who we are and what it means to understand who our students are? And when we tap into that, when we recognize the cultural understanding of who our students are, that is important, because the end of the day, there's a role that culture plays in teaching and learning. They constantly ask for cultural competency support. Okay, so Cassandra, this is what we do. When we talk about cultural competency support, like I said, we go back and we ask who am I, and how does that impact my classroom. One of the things that we do, we also ask questions about, how are our schools set up structurally. We have school norms, but those school norms, when we talk about culture, who are those school norms based on? When I think about what it means to be successful in school, it means to come in and do school. Now put the quote marks, come in and do school. But what does it mean to be able to do school? I've been in classrooms and teachers, sometimes the students are compliant, but even when classrooms are compliant, does that mean students are learning? Does that mean students understand the course and the teaching that is taking place? And so, when we know who our students are, and we know that we have a group of kinesthetic learners, we have a group of students that, spiritually for them, to sit in the classroom means movement, to be moving around, to be engaged, to have activities that really say, I'm involved in this learning, is important. Culture plays a role in teaching and learning. How we have our views on education, based on cultural values. Someone could say, when it comes to parents who drop their children off at school, or they get to school, sometimes the parents that don't show up, or the parents who are hard to reach, or the parents who aren't always at the parent-teacher conference. Sometimes we think that is that disconnect, saying that they don't care. And we know that even at looking at My Voice data, when we look at data, we know that those parents care because the students believe that. And for some, that essence of care may look different. Knowing that my child made it to school, I got them to school, maybe that is the fact that I care. That shows that demonstrates that. No, I may not show up at every parent-teacher conference. No, I may not show up or answer every time you call. But my support has been and shown and demonstrated by telling my child, you're expected to go to school and do the best that you can do. And so when we engage in conversations and engage in thinking about who our parents are, the families that our children come from when they come into our schools, what are their views on education, and recognizing that, and then how does that play out as well. The next thing I want to really talk about, because when we recognize who our students are, My Voice in Ohio surveyed students in grades 6 through 12, over 20,000 respondents, and it's national and international. Susan, did you want to add anything about the My Voice initiatives?
Ron, it might be a good point at this juncture to talk about the discrepancy with the aggregate data that we found between white and non-white students this year when we aggregated the data. Do you want to talk about that briefly?
Yeah, and so basically what we found is that when we look at 20,000 respondents in Ohio, and this is, like I say, surveying students in grades 6 through 12, and recognizing that there were some questions that said, we do have aspirations, we do care, and we do want and need that connection from our teachers. We need to have to make sure that our teachers pretty much understand who we are, and that relationship piece. And we know that that has an impact, that when students are connected, when teachers have a relationship with their students, students will perform for those teachers. That's a correlation that we have here. And so when we can have teachers begin to gain cultural competency and have a greater understanding of who their students are, they can build that relationship with their students. They can develop lessons and activities that are relevant. They can use culturally competent, relevant teaching strategies that really will have a greater impact on how their students are engaging in the classroom. And so the data did indicate that non-white students at a higher level of response needed to have that relationship with their teachers. And so basically that goes to how do we move beyond the visible cultural characteristics. I give this example, one in which you have the student who is, I'll make it fun, a ballerina. And so the student that's a ballerina, and she has her ballet show, and her grandmother's supposed to come to the show. A lot of times we know the activities our students are in. How many people can recall having that understanding of the activities their students participated in? If you know some of the activities, then go ahead and type in yes. Because we do. We know the activities our students are participating in. And so when they come in the next day, we can ask them, hey, how was the ballet show? How did you do? And then we stop there sometimes. And so my statement is how do we move beyond that and go past that visible piece? Because this child had shared with us, she had the ballet that she was performing in, and her grandmother was supposed to come. Recognizing that the biggest picture of that was understanding that her grandmother, she wanted her grandmother to. We have that relationship with our students, that makes a big difference, because then we can say not only the ballet, but did your grandmother attend? Because that was, again, the greater impact on allowing her to have that relationship with you. And that's going beyond the visible cultural characteristics. It's understanding that the belief, that the value that child has really is about saying, who is participating in the activities that I am a part of. And so what do? We work on the relationship gap. And when we work on the relationship gap, do you know your students? Moving beyond visible and cultural characteristics. Cassandra, that's awesome. That is a part of it. Church events, recitals. Thank you for giving me the word because I kept saying ballet. And Boy Scout programs. Recognizing that there's that extra piece to understanding who our students are. What does it mean to know your students? It means recognizing that there are cultural differences that exist between yourself and who your students are. And then also recognizing that within cultures, there are other pieces, there are other subcultures, and that every stereotype that exists within a culture or everything that we know about a culture is not necessarily the outlining factor for that one student. And basically we say when we recognize who our students are, when we have that understanding of who our students are, when we understand the cultural differences, their implications. And those implications pretty much say, you know, we change how we interact with our students, how we structure our classrooms, and also the expectations that we have for our students. When we look at next steps, it really is about moving towards cultural competency. How do we even become culturally proficient? And when we talk about culturally proficient, proficient means to be an expert. And so recognizing if you're culturally competent, how do we begin to say it's not just being competent, it's becoming an expert. We bridge cultures. We do things in our classrooms to bridge the gap between who we are and who our students are. And then we reflect, we re-examine, we reinforce classroom practices, the curriculum, and the structure in which we engage in our classroom with our students. And Susan, that puts us to the time in which we could move into questions and response.
Yes, yes. We are all aware of the fact that teachers are very busy people, so we really want to try to keep this session to an hour. So at this point, there's so much interaction between the participants and Rhonda. However, this part is for you to put any questions in the chat box for Rhonda at this point. So go ahead and do that. Maybe there was something that she touched upon that you want to expand a little bit more on. But again, this is the time for questions and response. So I know Cassandra is writing, she's typing up stuff at this point.
Okay.
And Rachel, Rochelle.
Rochelle, okay.
Mm-hmm.
While they're typing, you know, I just kind of want to go back and reiterate to become culturally competent. We're thinking about, you know, how we come to know who we are, how we come to know our students, and then how that informs our practice. And making sure that we have high academic achievement, high standards for all of our students. The rigor is there.
Okay.
Can you say? Oh,
yeah, that's Cassandra. She's there. A book that could help them with cultural competency that staff could use as a guidebook. And then Denise wants to know if we could make the PowerPoint available as well. But go ahead and answer the cultural competency book or guide.
Okay. Cultural competency, definitely. There is Gloria Latson-Billings. If you pull her work, and I was just saying to Susan here recently, I have had the pleasure of studying under one of her students when they were in graduate school. And when you talk about cultural competency and understanding cultural competency, Gloria Latson-Billings really kind of laid the groundwork, I think, for that work. There are others out there, but she has a book called Dream Keepers, and she has a book called Crossing Over to Canaan. I'm actually looking on my bookshelf. I have both of them on my shelf. The book Dream Keepers, I remember when a middle school principal, Beth Harriam, I was that middle school teacher. The the middle school principal, when I first started teaching, he signed the copy and gave me a copy of Dream Keepers. It is a book that I use in higher education. It is a book that I refer teachers to all the time. It gives you some specific examples of what some teachers have done. It talks about cultural competency more in depth, recognizing that when you become culturally competent, you are focused on academic achievement. You are focused on setting high expectations for students. You have a socio-political consciousness, which to me is the responsive piece, which means that you are creating classrooms and curriculum that is responsive to the students. Students are engaged in actually making decisions about the curriculum. And then, there's the cultural competence piece. You're doing everything to understand who your students are, and you do that by starting with yourself. And for me, that's the relationships piece. How do we build those relationships?
Just a note to participants about the PowerPoint. We are going to make that available for folks today, so if you want to download that, we'll have that information for you.
Rochelle, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Rochelle Warren, invest in relationship building when professional development time is limited. It's interesting that you put that. I was just talking with someone in a school district, and we were talking about PD on cultural competency, and PD on cultural competency, we were talking about, she wanted me to come in and do a workshop in August. And so what does that look like when we know professional development should be ongoing? And so one of the things that we talked about is also saying, how do we ensure that we are reflecting and revisiting what it means to be culturally competent? And so maybe it is at the beginning of every professional development staff meeting or team meeting, you're taking time to reconnect, you're taking time to ask questions. I put together a workbook, and basically that workbook just allows you to continue to go back and be reflective. One of the things that that I have in the PowerPoint there, I'll go back to the last slide. Examine and reinforce. Reflect on your classroom practices, reflect on your curriculum and the structure in which you are operating in your classroom and how you've structured your classroom. But I do believe you have to spend time on what it means to develop relationships with your students. And finding that time, if it is just on your own or in small spaces, to do so. Beth, I'm glad you were saying the same thing. Beth, how do you break through barriers? You have to acknowledge them. You have to be willing to acknowledge the barriers that you have. And I'm thinking that's what you mean. But then also recognizing that, go back to cultural capital. Go back to the fact that all students bring something to the table. What is it that they bring to the table? Let's point to the fact that, oh, these students can't read. Oh, wait. Let's point to the fact that they can learn lyrics to a song in a matter of minutes, a day, or however long. So how do we integrate that into the classroom? Children began learning the ABCs through song. Why is it all of a sudden we've taken out song in instruction? There's a high school here in a suburb of Ohio that the students took a couple of math statements or math facts, and they learned it linked to song. And it was that allowed one high school and another high school within the same district to tap into that song, YouTube it, and then all of a sudden students are remembering this concept, this math concept. And so how do we break through barriers? We say that they're facts, but it doesn't have to be a barrier. How do we break through the fact that parents aren't showing up or parents aren't coming? What can we do? So we ask, what can we do differently to invite those parents in? Are we contacting them every time something has happened? Or are we contacting them when I say something that has happened, something negative? Or are we contacting them when something great has happened? Are we sending notes home? Do we have the ability to text with them? So when it's time to engage in, I need need your help on this. You've contacted them so many other times about something positive. So how do we break through barriers? How do we reach each student's needs? We know what those needs are. We recognize based on those needs, here are the different things that we can do, but also we empower them. Students want to be empowered. When we look at the data from My Voice, we recognize that students want to be engaged, students want to be challenged. And so how are we presenting them with curriculum or opportunities to develop and design curriculum that is significant to them? This is what I say. You and your students, when we think about cultural competency and we think about culturally relevant teaching, this is what I say. You and your students work together to create an environment where the content is challenging and designed to meet the needs of a diverse student body while ensuring all students feel valued and empowered as change agents. That's culturally relevant teaching. When you empower students to become and to be change agents, it is through building relationships, it is through acknowledging who you are, it is through acknowledging who your students are, and allowing them to have input into the curriculum as well. I hope that answered the question.
I think so.
Okay.
Cassandra's asking, the teachers shared it's been a great success in building relationships with their families as a question mark. For students to write her narrative essay telling the teacher all about their child. Very similar to what you've been talking about this afternoon, Rhonda. Absolutely.
Yes, it is. Cassandra, that was one of the activities that I did when I taught. I would start out the school year, and I don't know if you know how long you've been away from the college campus, but the blue books, I remember taking all the blue books that were in the hallway one time, and I thought I'll be able to use these for something. When I got to my classroom, I had blue books for years, I will say that much. That's how many I took. But students were asked to write in this blue book their name, their address, you know, their phone number. Who do I contact? I didn't say what's mom's name, what is dad's name. I recognized that my students came from different places, different families. I recognized that the address, even in talking about the address, write it in pencil, write phone numbers in pencil. Might this change? But then I went a step further, and I asked, you know, what are your dreams? What do you want to do when you grow up? You know, I asked them things like, what's your favorite subject and what's your least favorite subject? But I also asked them why. And then I did that very thing. It wasn't an essay, but I sent home a sheet that had a couple of different questions for the folks at home. One of those questions was, tell me something great about your child. And then it was another question was, tell me something that I need to know about your child. And it really is making those types of connections. It was, you know, and this is one of those basic things that I think sometimes we forget because of the time that we have or don't have. Making a connection with every person at home at the very beginning of the school year. You know, making sure that the first time that they heard my voice, it wasn't because I was asking for something. It was because I was excited about their child being in the classroom and me being able to work with them. And so, Cassandra, I think you're on target, that teacher is on target about asking folks at home to provide feedback and insight about the child that's in your classroom. Because we know research talks about there's the home child and there's the school child. And so when we have an understanding of who those children are, it does have an impact on what it means for instruction, for teaching and learning in the classroom.
On that note, we're going to wrap it up. But in case you folks don't know, Rhonda is going to do another webinar on April 23rd.